Okay, so this is not mine, but it's a good essay here that I think would be helpful for us to overview. And so that first page there, page 29, is nice in the fact that it shows you a little bit of some key figures during this time period and where they worked at. Now, the very first figure at the top is Isaac Backus, and we'll talk about him at the end here a little bit. Isaac Backus was a Massachusetts man. He was a pastor, and most helpful for us today is that he was a historian, and he recorded the plight of churches, Baptists, as they sought for religious freedom. And he took his reasonings and his pleadings all the way to the Continental Congress. And we'll read about how that went when Isaac Backus stood before the Continental Congress. Now, I'll tell you that throughout books like This Day in Baptist History and others, there's lots of references to Isaac Backus, and a lot of it is because they're quoting him. We have the history, Isaac Backus's History of the Baptists, up in the library. It's a thick, large book, and we owe him a debt. He is one of several Baptist historians that we owe a great debt to. Isaac Backus, David Benedict, John Christian, Thomas Armitage, J.M. Cramp are some key Baptist historians. I don't think that we're going to have time. I would have liked to take a couple lessons and talk through some of these Baptist historians, but I think for the sake of time, we'll just leave it at Isaac Backus and what he did. So anyway, that is Isaac Backus. Roger Williams and John Clark, of course, we know a little bit about them, and talked about those men a little bit there. John Clark, Roger Williams. This is just, again, a brief overview. There's so many more that we could talk about. The Philadelphia Association of Baptist Churches, I believe that was founded in 1707. Very influential group of Baptist churches, and many men came out from that. James Ireland, who we read about today, as well as John Leland in Virginia. John Leland, James Madison. John Leland, the Baptist preacher who strongly influenced James Madison toward freedom of religion, not toleration of religion, freedom of religion, freedom from a state church. And we owe a debt of gratitude to John Leland for his work alongside of James Madison in the freedom of religion in our Bill of Rights. Shubal Stearns and Daniel Marshall, we talked about them yesterday. Remember them, the separate Baptists, and how that Shubal Stearns, Daniel Marshall, beginning up in New England, working their way down to Virginia, putting together a team that went down into central North Carolina and establishing the Sandy Creek Baptist Association and seeing numbers and numbers of churches established. And then other names that you'll read in time here in your textbook is William Screven and Richard Furman in South Carolina. All right, so let's see here. Letter A, Colonial America and the Rhode Island experiment. So about 115 years after Columbus discovered America, England established its first permanent settlement in the New World. Jamestown, Virginia, and Jamestown's faded, while the colony up north in New England, founded more for religious purposes as opposed to political and economic purposes of Jamestown, was founded there at Plymouth Rock. And a little bit of information there about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. there and their association in England and in Holland. Certainly both had an independent separatist spirit. But the Pilgrims retained, of course, the Protestant doctrines of infant baptism and of a state church, while the Baptists rejected infant baptism and rejected a state church. That's key distinctive there among those two groups. Then next page, page 30. 10 years later, in 1630, the Pilgrims proved that the English could settle New England. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was established in Boston, a little north of Plymouth, by a group of Puritans who, likewise upset with the Church of England, but did not have the separatist tendencies of the Pilgrims. Their governor, John Winthrop, preached a sermon, A City on a Hill. And City on a Hill, though, this religious nature sermon wasn't a sermon about religious diversity. We find that the Puritans fled to America for religious liberty for themselves. They didn't want to pass necessarily religious liberty on to everyone else. So we learn a little bit here about some Baptist history from some Supreme Court justices. Some cases are cited there. Number 2, Roger Williams. Review here for us a little bit. Roger Williams, like Luther and Calvin, had a background in law and religion, and became a stenographer and office manager for a famous lawyer in England. And then letter B, the only church allowed in Boston was the Puritan Congregational church. Everyone in town had to belong to the church and support it with tithes. And this is just 10 years after the Pilgrims' landing. So Williams began to preach against such things, and he soon became persona non grata. It makes you sound really important to just whip out Latin phrases there. So whenever you're really, somebody's ridiculing you, just study up on your Latin, whip it out, and they will back off, I promise. It's a good modus operandi for your life. According to A History of Our Country, a secular school textbook first published in 1953, Roger Williams, described as the apostle of religious freedom, taught that the state had no control over a man's conscience. I wonder if Roger Williams is in any public school history textbook today. I wonder if George Washington shows up very much. I learn a lot about social reformers in the 20th century. Some of our bus captains are challenging our kids and just to get a feel for where they're at about American history, and they are finding a dearth of knowledge about basic American history. It's not taught in school. Social studies are taught as history in schools today. So Pastor Williams here, Roger Williams, in 1635, were forced to the wilderness of Massachusetts, finding relief just from Indian friends. 1636, Williams purchases land from local Indians and founds Providence, Rhode Island. And the Providence Portsmouth Compact there, we talked about that. And the founding of the First Baptist Church of Providence. This is interesting to note about Roger Williams' life. Up to this point in his life, Williams was not a Baptist. He was probably familiar with John Smith and Thomas Helwys in England. You might remember those from the General Particular Baptist lessons that we had. He probably came under influence of Ezekiel Holliman and Catherine Scott. Holliman baptized Williams, and they started the First Baptist Church, Providence, 1639. But after only a few months' membership in that Baptist church, Williams voluntarily surrendered his membership, remaining friendly to Baptists and religious freedom, but he himself reverted back to or took on seeker status. In other words, Religious affiliation, unsure. However, he was certainly friendly and helpful to those that desired religious freedom. Important book, you probably know that. You see a serious misspelling here, letter E there. The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. Of course, that might be like Middle English that he used, I don't know. Published in 1644 in London, was a defense of liberty of conscience. And this Bloody Tenet of Persecution impacted John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. So Williams' writing here on this persecuting on religious grounds and the wrong-naturedness of that was effective. So then let's look here at page 32. Number 3, John Clark. And Clark was a medical doctor, studied languages and religion, came to Boston 1637. And at this time, Anabaptism had been declared a crime, and it was illegal to believe or preach, ye must be born again. And when a preacher named John Wheelwright was disenfranchised, disarmed, and banished. Disenfranchised means he was no longer to buy or sell or conduct business. And later, when 76 citizens were disarmed by the Boston court, Clark assumed the leadership of the banished brethren, convincing them to move before blood was shed. And as we noticed before, they headed north and then quickly headed south. I apologize, Haley, but I don't want to make revisionist history here. I want to be very clear about this, that going north from Boston was not desirable at that time. Now, today, going north from Boston, I don't know that we would use the term desirable, but it's an option. How about that? It can be done. It can be done. Just have to wear like leather clothes, a coonskin cap, have a muzzle loader and a knife, and prepare for the great wilderness and surviving in Maine. So he sojourned in New Hampshire, looked across to what he thought was the promised land in Maine and realized it was actually Egypt. And he needed to head south to Providence. Anyway, Dr. Clark his followers went to Providence. And Williams convinced Clark to settle on this island, purchased from the Indians 1638, renamed Rhode Island. The town of Portsmouth started that year, just right by Providence, and Newport there, Newport Baptist Church. They organized there. Clark was first pastor. Roger Williams recounts a revival conducted in 1649 by Clark and other men in Massachusetts of Seekonk. One of the men baptized by Clark was Obadiah Holmes. And then this goes on to recount the story of Clark and Holmes, and was it John Crandall visiting William Whitter, and the persecution as a result of that meeting of Obadiah Holmes and what he went through for that. So, top of page 33, what is some fallout from the Obadiah Holmes beating? Dr. Clark writes a tract exposing religious persecution in New England, and published in London, and it had a lengthy title. Ill News from New England, or a narrative of New England persecution, wherein is declared that while old England is becoming new, New England is becoming old. There's a little brief book title on a tract there. So Aimed at convincing the king of the need of religious liberty, Clark declared this: "It is unbiblical, unchristlike, unnatural, unspiritual to coerce conscience." Williams and Clark traveled to England to obtain a charter for Rhode Island, a charter that would establish religious liberty for the first time in an entire colony. Dr. Clark's labors took 12 years, finally, 1663, from Charles II of all people. Charles II, right in the middle of the time that he had imprisoned John Bunyan and allowed John Bunyan and other Baptist pastors, the 5 Mile Rule, the Conventicle Act is going on in England. He gets a charter from Charles II for religious liberty here in the colony of Rhode Island. B, middle page 33. We're at 17, we get into the 1700s. Rhode Island was the first, not the last colony where Baptist churches were started. Massachusetts. Baptists struggled in Massachusetts because of the state church control of that state. And a couple men and churches are mentioned here. First Baptist of Swansea in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then Thomas Gould, our book talks about him. Finally, after 16 years, the Boston court granted them permission to meet, not till 1681. Permission to meet, not freedom. They granted some toleration. 2, William Penn, founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, and forever embedded on our mind is the picture on the Quaker Oats cylinder box that we look at there in the morning. I don't know if they have this picture on like the little microwave packs or not, or if it's just you have to go like old school. I mean, it takes a long time. Those are like 10 minutes to make those, so you want something quicker for oatmeal now. It's like 30 seconds. Anyway, William Penn, little fluffy gray hair going on there. We'll let him pass. I don't think they had a lot of barbershops back then. William Penn, founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, how about that? And the leading Quaker in America, son of a Baptist father. His colony became fertile ground for Baptist churches. So Quakers, salt of the earth, good, religious, moral people, but they believed in a couple things. They believed in advanced revelation. They believed that you could get a direct revelation from God, and they would often speak out in their services as though they had gotten direct revelation from the Lord. And they also believed in the inner light. And your inner light, sometimes referred to as conscience, could guide you in the same way that, along the lines that Scripture could. So you get a lot of pre-charismatic ideology in the Quakers, though their morality and their work ethic and such would be generally among a faithful member would be strong and godly. They opened up the door for this inner light and these advanced revelations, sort of being overcome by the Spirit, things like that. We can shut that door, I think. You guys getting chilly? Yes, one person said yes. Okay. All right, so anyway, William Penn, and we've got some Baptists going to PA here. Thomas Dungan, Irish, fled Baptist persecution under Charles II, came to Rhode Island, then to Pennsylvania, 1684. Elias Keach, Benjamin Keach, here churches in Pennapeck. The Pennapeck Church was very influential, sort of like Sandy Creek was influential in North Carolina. The Pennapeck Church in Pennsylvania, very influential, far-reaching church planting place there. They started Baptist churches in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And then 1707, talking here about the Philadelphia Association of Baptist Churches. And that expanded, started with 5 and expanded from there. Maine and South Carolina, all right. William Screven here is going to rescue Maine from the throes of their Egyptian apostasy that they were so committed to, and Druid worship, a lot of human sacrifice. Cannibals lived up there and things like that, and it was really a dangerous, horrible place. So the northernmost colony paved the way for the first church in the southern colonies. William Screven, member of Boston Baptist, fed up with the persecution that the Puritans were giving him in Boston, led a group of believers 60 miles north to Kittery on the southern tip of Maine in 1682. Kittery, is that still there, Haley? Kittery still there? Kittery, Maine? Yep, it's still there. And, well, he did that, because of the persecution, and secondly, because he loved lobster. And so got a little more access there to lobster dinners there in Kittery. And 28 members got even fed up with more persecution in Maine. And so they took a boat all the way down to South Carolina and started the first Baptist church in the southern colonies. So Screven, have you read about him yet in America in Crimson Red? William Screven? You will. They have an essay on him. You'll read about him. Interesting story. From Boston to Maine to South Carolina. Pioneer spirit, though. You see these men are willing to move to establish places where there's religious freedom. On the other hand, there are those that stayed. And I think that the Lord uses people differently. There are people that the Lord puts to a mission field that's more of an open mission field where the people are receptive. But the Lord also has people stay in apostate places like Maine through the thick and the thin. But it's true. Not everybody would love to be in Pastor Lewis's position, but Hyde Park and the south side of Chicago and the city of Chicago still needs a church, doesn't it? It might be a church that is not going to have all the opportunities that another church might have. The point is, God will guide each one of us individually where He wants us to be at, and we just need to be willing to surrender to wherever that is. If it's to a mission field where it's exciting and there's freedom and there's results, or if it is to a place where it is a challenge and a grind every day of our lives. So just pray that God will show you where that is that you're to go, because God does not want all of us in the same place. The fields are white. There's lots of fields. There's needs everywhere. In the last 3 weeks, I've got lists of 10 churches that are without pastors and 5 other churches that need an assistant pastor right now. And every time I talk to another pastor, there's great needs today. I think you're going to hear a challenge. I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing today you're going to hear a challenge in chapel from our guest preacher about a great need, all the needs he's aware of. And understand that the needs that he's aware of, multiply that times, let's just say Pastor Nance said, is there a guy you have? We've got a church right not far from us in Tampa that needs a pastor. Put your hands down, guys. I know. Florida pastor, like, I think I'm ready. I think I can pass the novice test now. Tampa sounds pretty good. I think the Lord's leading me there. So I was able to go to Maine in October, and a group of 10 pastors, a lot of them from Maine, were on Haley's brother-in-law's ordination committee. And, many of those men gave their life to the state of Maine, to different churches in Maine, and no mega churches, not one. But many of them 60s and 50s, 60s, 70s, faithful. And so God has just a different, we don't know, but we do know this. If we come to God with our demands and our expectations and our requirements, we're probably going to miss out on what he really wants us to do. So, anyway, I think of a William Screven who pioneered in South Carolina when I think of an Isaac Backus who stayed in Massachusetts. And presumably both did what God wanted them to do. So wherever it is, that's where your joy and your peace and your blessing is going to be at. Our circumstances don't dictate our joy, don't need to dictate our joy. Because you can live in pure desolation and still be happy. Right, Haley? I'm done. Baptist pioneers. Look at this here, second paragraph, number 3. When 1700 rolled around, there were less than 20 Baptist churches in all of America, only one of which is in the southern colonies. 200 years later, that's not very long, 200 years later, the largest non-Catholic group of Christians in America, Baptists. How did God move so rapidly? How did God move so rapidly? We alluded to this yesterday. The Great Awakening did not originate with Baptists at all. We have Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and the New Lights. So I'm not going to review all of this since it's fresh on our minds, but notice there under the section on Jonathan Edwards, we didn't speak too much about him. His famous sermon there midway through, sinners in the hands of an angry God. Reading Edwards' biography, there's a good one by a man named Murray. It's in our library. Murray, Jonathan Edwards' biography. And then reading a biography about George Whitefield, those two couldn't have been more opposite in many ways. Whitefield's this booming orator, and Edwards, I'm told, was a manuscript preacher. He wrote out his sermons and read them, and even read them kind of close to his eyes because of his poor eyesight. And yet, God's power was the same because people are holding on to their pews when Edwards preached sinners in the hands of an angry God. It's a good sermon to read. You can get that still today. He talks about people being dangled over the abyss like a spider hanging by one little strand of a web, ready to fall at any moment into the abyss of eternal doom. They heard him say that, read that, and conviction fell upon them, and he was preaching it in churches. That's the big thing with Jonathan Edwards. He's preaching here to church members, unconverted church members, because of the effect of the dead church life and the effects of infant baptism making people members of a church, and they never had to make a personal profession of faith. People are being saved in churches. In New England area, pretty much stayed locally through there. George Whitefield, as you know, traveled, came from England and traveled around from Massachusetts and Connecticut all the way down to the southern colonies. And rejected by the Puritan pastors, while many Baptist pastors opposed him because of his Calvinistic tendencies. But Whitefield's message, "Ye must be born again," stirred up people. And then we looked at the New Lights, page 35, and the New Lights becoming separatists. And here's what John Christian says in that little box. Converts who received the name separatists were taught to throw aside tradition and take the Word of God as their only guide in all manners of religious faith and practice. Well, this is going to change them. And so these separatists, these New Lights, searched the Scriptures, became Baptists. And so look at from 1734 to 1776, and the number of Baptist churches there really increased. And then we have the South. And we talked about this letter D yesterday, so I won't review all that. But Shubal Stearns, a Yankee, sees the light. His salvation. Then the move to Virginia, along with his brother-in-law, Daniel Marshall. And the middle of number 2 does point out Stearns was the spellbinding preacher, while Marshall was the hardworking second man. And then Sandy Creek, North Carolina, Stearns, Marshall, and their families down the Shenandoah, across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sandy Creek, first building a separate Baptist church, then cabins, and then church planning began. Within 17 years, Sandy Creek Church sent out 125 preachers, started 42 churches. E, Baptist role in leading the colonies' path to independence, Bill of Rights, page 37. Virginia, the crucible of liberty. Colonial Virginia, bastion of the Church of England, was troubled by the growing number of separate Baptists who resisted this government control over them. So the response was fines for not attending the state church, order to pay tithes, and when refusal, the confiscation of goods, and ordered the Baptist preachers to get their license to preach, which resulted in imprisonment and arrest throughout the colony. So fines, confiscation, and imprisonment was the plight of Baptists in Virginia. Rewards for turning in a Baptist lawbreaker, and infant children removed from Baptist homes and sprinkled, baptized, infant sprinkling. Coming to a head with James Ireland, who you read about today, converted from the Church of England, a follower of Shubal Stearns, baptized and commissioned by Samuel Harris, fiery evangelist, started several churches in Virginia. He was threatened with fines and jail if he preached in Culpeper. Ireland did his duty, and he was arrested and jailed. For 5 months, he would stand at the window of the Culpeper jail, his palace in Culpeper, as he called it, and preach to the residents of the city. Patrick Henry gets, as a lawyer, busy defending Baptist preachers imprisoned in cities of Chesterfield and Fredericksburg. He argues before the court. Patrick Henry, the lawyer, argues this before a court. If I have rightly understood, the king's attorney of this colony has framed an indictment or a crime of great magnitude as disturbers of the peace. Did I hear it distinctly? Or was it a mistake of my own? Did I hear an expression as if a crime that these men are charged with? What? For preaching the gospel of the Son of God? Good point. That's a crime. Patrick Henry got stirred up, saw this need, saw what was going on, saw firsthand religious persecution. And in his defense, he comes to a strong position on this. Isaac Backus, who we'll take a little bit of time and talk about today. Here is pastoring Middleborough First Baptist Church in Massachusetts from 1756 all the way through 1806. Can you imagine the changes that he saw? Can you imagine the restrictions that were on him in 1756 that changed after 50 years, stayed in one place? He helped revolution, he helped religious liberty. His book, you can get a list of all his books and tracts and writings. There's a lot of them. A book entitled Political Sermons of the American Founding Era. 1730-1805, he gathers sermons from American pulpits that were sermons about religious liberty. And he's ranked here with Roger Williams, John Leland, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison as a preeminent figure in establishing freedom of conscience in America. McLaughlin said, Backus was the most forceful and effective writer America produced on behalf of the evangelical theory of separation of church and state. The contribution of Backus to religious liberty is further attested to And we have here more U.S. Supreme Court citing these men. Isn't that interesting? Letter F, struggle for independence. Taxation without representation was first voiced by who? Our book told us, Baptist pastors, who rejected to colonial governments which forced Baptists to pay tithes to the Church of England. Revolutionary pamphleteer John Allen to Rhode Island, the first colony to declare independence, 1776, May 4th, 2 months before the Declaration of Independence. 3, Baptist preacher, patriot in South Carolina, Richard Furman, Furman University now in South Carolina, named after him. Young pastor in Charleston, South Carolina, opponent of English tyranny, chased out of Charleston by the English, Lord Cornwallis, who was at that time general of the British Army in that region, declared he feared the prayers of that godly youth more than the armies of Sumter and Marion. John Hart, New Jersey, Baptist chaplains. Notable is John Gano. Many people believe John Gano, Baptist chaplain, baptized George Washington by immersion. There's not a direct, exact statement to that end, but there's enough recorded history that that's a very good possibility, I'd say. And we do know that George Washington, you'll read this later on, gave his battle sword to his chaplain, John Gano, as well. So pretty good record, pretty good history indicating that Gano baptized Washington. So anyway, the struggle for the Bill of Rights. And we'll talk about this, but you just cannot overlook the strength of John Leland. Last paragraph. One of the states opposed to ratification was Virginia. According to the Library of Congress, the Virginia ratifying convention in James Madison's constituents, among whom were a large number of Baptists who wanted freedom of religion secured, expected him to push for a Bill of Rights. The leading Baptist in Virginia, Pastor John Leland, secured a promise from Madison that if Leland would support Madison's bid for office, that Madison would support a Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution. The first freedom in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was a restatement of Baptist doctrinal distinctives. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Brief challenge here in conclusion for this, and that is to consider personal walk, the idea of contending for the faith, the idea of spreading the gospel, and willingness to pay a price to advance religious and civil liberty.